Today we have the pleasure to talk to Ulrich Jochheim, a policy analyst in the European Parliamentary Research Service. Ulrich is an expert on China, the third biggest economy in the world based on the exchange rate and the biggest economy even when it comes to purchasing power. And with its estimated 1.4 billion people, China has a bigger population than any other country in the world. When you put all of China's railways together, they could loop around the world twice. So, Ulrich, welcome.
Many thanks, Chris, and I think you have already given very good reasons why we should deal with China. And on top of those reasons, I think there are two others which are worth mentioning. The first is that together with the US, China is the single most important trading partner of the European Union. And as we have recently seen, this might have huge impact on developments in Europe. Like many people, as you know, in Europe now complain about the rise in prices, the high inflation rate. And what's happening is that there is this corona-induced lockdown in Shanghai. So a lot of goods are not sent to Europe and the demand is there. So supply missing and prices rise. And then the other main reason is that China nowadays is by far the single most important source of CO2 emissions. And one has to say that on a per capita basis, they are much lower than other countries. But still, I think that they currently emit 27% of global CO2.
And what do we know about the demographic developments in China and why should we deal with them?
The truth is that there are countries, let's say like the US and Australia, which emit many more emissions on a per capita basis. But China is still far away from that. But if we assume that in the future China will grow at a growth rate, let's say, of 4%, it's very likely that also its per capita emissions are going to rise. So from that point of view, it's very important to know whether China will have 1 billion people or 1.5 billion people, because that would clearly have an impact on the overall level of CO2 emissions. So demographics are important, and that's, I think, why it's worth discussing the development of demographics in China, especially because in the 1950s and 1960s, every Chinese woman would have between 5 and 6 kids.
How was that decision implemented and what's been the effect?
The impact has been tremendous because, as I said before, in the 1950s, we talk about 5 to 6 kids per woman. And today, the fertility rate is estimated at 1.7 kids, only slightly higher than in the EU. So actually, the interesting point is because of this very strong decline in the fertility rate, probably higher than authorities would have assumed 40 years ago, they have now tried to reverse the reforms and have introduced changes to the law, allowing people in urban areas to have 2 or even 3 kids. But, however, now we are 6 years after the first implementation of these changes, and the impact has been really minor.
So how does this strong decline in the fertility rate affect everyday life for Chinese people today?
Actually, there's a very nice kind of combination saying 4-2-1, which means that you would have, in a typical family almost today, 4 grandparents, then the 2 in the couple, plus 1 kid. And the impact is, again, really tremendous because the couple then will have to take care of 4 elderly people, which normally, when they age, raise the health costs. Public pensions are low in China, and at the same time, this couple has to take care of the education of the kid, which is really tremendously expensive in some cases, because as you might know, like Shanghai has really top-performing high schools, which are really the number 1, number 2 in the PISA League. But in order to get your kid into that school, you have to live in an area close to that school. So the impact is that if you want to make sure that your kid gets into a very good high school, in order to allow it to get into a very good university, it's a little bit like, the elite university system, like the UK has a little bit. So to ensure that your kid gets into one of those elite universities, it has to go to an elite high school. So you have to pay a very high price for accommodation. It's really statistically proven that in the areas around top-performing high schools, the price of accommodation is much higher than in other similar areas of Shanghai, for example.
So what might the medium and long-term effect of such a decline in fertility be?
Yeah, as you might know, I'm an economist by training, so we talk about potential long-term growth rates. And normally there are three factors we assume which influence the growth rate in the long term. It's the change in investments, what we call capital. Then you have the change in labor, which actually means the change in the number of people employed out of the people in working age population. And the third effect is a little bit complicated. It's a mixture of technology plus management techniques. So assuming that capital, we cannot really easily forecast how investments are going to develop. But what is certain is that as long as a country like China or Japan doesn't really allow for immigration, you have a pretty reliable forecast of future employment numbers. So if clearly the fertility rate is already down nowadays, we know that in 20 years, the number of people employed in China will go down, which will, per definition, reduce the long-term potential growth rate of China. Then the other aspect is clearly public finances, because as I have been saying before, normally the aging of people implies rising health costs and rising costs for old age care. And in the case of China, we have to assume, because as I said, the demographic forecasts are probably very reliable, that there will be a huge increase in the costs both for public pensions and for old age care.
Ulrich Jochheim, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for watching. Stay tuned for our next episode, in which we will discuss the Hukou system and its global impact.